Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I am coming to you from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. We are focused today on critical thinking therapy. And in this brief time that I will have with you, I will begin to introduce the idea of critical thinking therapy and to unpack it a bit for you and to explain to you, again, in beginning terms, why critical thinking therapy is important for people who are striving to develop themselves and to become more self-actualized or to become more self-actualizing. So before I launch into our questions and the issues at the heart of this presentation, let me begin by asking you a few questions. And when I ask the question, I will then pause for a couple of seconds to help you, to give you some time to begin to process the kinds of questions that critical thinking therapy can help you answer or better answer. So here are some of the questions. What are the most pressing problems I face? So you're going to say, what are the most, in your mind, what are the most pressing problems I face? What can I do to improve my attitude and outlook on life? What can I change about myself or my circumstances so I'm happier and more fulfilled? So what can I change about myself that will help me live at a higher level of self-actualization? How can I fit myself into a society that is frequently superficial or pathological without losing my identity? What can I contribute to such a world? How can I get outside my merry-go-round thinking, like worrying, and create new options for myself? What are the barriers to my achieving what I could achieve? What are the barriers? How can I reach my potential and become self-actualized? You could ask yourself, where am I on the ladder of self-actualization? Or where am I on the ladder toward becoming more self-actualized? Where are you on the ladder, and what are the barriers to your achieving higher ground? Am I satisfied with my job profession? Do I need to pursue a different career path? Can I continue to live with the people I have been living with? Is something about my work or home life causing me to be mentally unwell? What can I do about my conditions to improve them? How can I take the important questions I need to reason through one by one and reason through them at the highest level possible? What are my real options? What are my best options? So I've been reading from the book, the new smaller version of Critical Thinking Therapy, Self-Actualization, and Happiness Toolbox for Everyone, which has just been released. And this is a concise edition of the larger Critical Thinking Therapy book for those who want to go deeper and to have a full sense of what critical thinking therapy can do for your clients or for yourself. Note that when I say critical thinking therapy from this point forward, I'm going to also be including in that critical thinking self-therapy. So that means that applies to any of us who are working individually or with other people through the book, and therefore applying the tools of critical thinking to our life. So this would be considered self-therapy. I'm including that under therapy. So I've opened with a few questions, which you can see all of us need to reason well through in order to be functioning well within the important domains or dimensions of our life. Critical thinking therapy helps us answer these questions and open up what is really going on in our thinking so we can find the problems in our thinking and improve our thinking in order to reason at a higher level of quality and therefore feel better emotionally. Now, I'm going to come back to the theory of critical thinking, which is, of course, at the heart of critical thinking therapy. And I will unpack the theory a bit, but we can only begin to do that here. First, let me step back and talk about some background points that we need to understand to appreciate the importance of critical thinking therapy and where it stands in connection with or comparison to other therapies. If you are trying to make sense of the world of therapy, it will be difficult for a number of reasons. One is that in therapy, there is no integrated approach that is used across all mental health therapies. There are psychological theories that are used. There are sociological theories that are used. There are social workers may tend to look at therapy different from psychologists, who may tend to look at it differently from psychiatrists. And then there are people who are just hanging out their sign and saying, I'm a therapist. And so you have, first of all, different academic fields weighing in terms of the question, what are the best mental health therapies? And again, we've never brought these theories together in an integrated way, which is what is needed for us to make sense of the mind and to fully understand the mind and what it is doing when it is functioning well and when it is functioning poorly. And of course, this is going to be highly complex, this process, and we're going to have to deal with a lot of outliers that will make us uncomfortable, but we're going to stay in the center here and talk about mental health therapy for people who are dealing with the everyday kinds of problems that people tend to go to therapists for. They're functioning all right for the most part, but they want to function at a higher level. And then there will be people who have more serious need, and those will fall into a different category. But the tools of critical thinking therapy are relevant to any form of approach to helping a human function better in human life. So one, we do not currently have an integrated approach to mental health therapies. And what critical thinking can do is to provide integrating structures that get us closer to such an approach. And it provides the integrated approach itself. So it helps integrate the other approaches, and it is an integrating force itself. And now I'll come back to this and unpack it as we move forward. What we need to understand to appreciate what critical thinking can do for us in therapy is to understand that every human being has the ongoing challenge of keeping oneself mentally well within the societies in which we are living. Sometimes we have no choice in terms of our movement. Sometimes we have greater choice. But in any case, we're living within some societies, and these put constraints on us by implication, and therefore we don't live in a vacuum, and we can't just express our own genes as we would wish to. We are going to be bumping up against other people throughout life, and we're going to be influenced by them. We're going to influence them, and we're going to be affected by the institutions and the cultural traditions that are swirling around us. And therefore, again, we each have the responsibility to figure out how we will adjust, survive, and become and do more than that within these societies, help improve them. And in order to help improve them, we need to be mentally well. So we each face this challenge of maintaining our mental and emotional well-being. Some people naturally do this better than others. All of us can use the tools of critical thinking to improve, but some people need the tools more than others. And again, everyone can benefit from them. The current approaches to mental health therapy, bringing in another problem that critical thinking helps address. One of the problems is that not only do we not have an integrated approach to mental health therapies, but the current systems that we do have, the current theoretical systems that we are working within, tend to be partial or problematic. And this is true also for the concept of critical thinking itself when it is applied. So we need a rich concept of critical thinking. We need to apply it in the therapeutic setting. And this is going to help us figure out where other theoretical schools of thought may be helpful or may not be helpful. For example, let us say one current system of thinking within therapy is Freudian thinking, traditional psychoanalytic thinking or theory. And this is based largely in a conditioning model, and there is a lot more to it than what I'm going to say here. But the point is that it is a system of thinking to some degree, and some theoreticians, therapists will still bring this in to the therapeutic setting using this primarily or exclusively, and it will be therefore problematic in many cases, if not all, because it will only be bringing in one part of theory that we need. In other words, yes, conditioning may be very important, but it may not be the only thing here that we need to be focusing on. So that we need to understand that any therapist may be using partial or problematic theories in the therapeutic setting. So we have some problems leading to the point that what we need and what we have needed all along is to bring the rich and entire and thorough toolbox of critical thinking to the therapeutic setting, to the field of mental health therapy. We have some of the tools of critical thinking have been successfully brought into mental health therapy, primarily through the works of Albert Ellis in rational emotive behavior therapy. And his work has influenced cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, but cognitive behavioral therapy approaches tend to be highly mixed, and therefore they may to some degree include the tools of critical thinking. They may not include them much at all. So we would have to look at the individual therapist or cognitive behavioral theoretician to see the extent to which that person is bringing the tools of critical thinking actually into a given piece of work. So what I'm saying to you is we have some of the tools of critical thinking being used across mental health therapies. Of course we do. And in some cases, we have a lot of the tools being brought in. There may be a highly skilled therapist who is very good intuitively at asking Socratic questions and has done a lot of reading and is bringing this background reading into this questioning process. This is happening, but what we need is more of this to be happening and a lot more of it. So what we're not asking, are there any tools of critical thinking being used in the therapeutic process? Because the answer is yes. The question is to what degree, to what extent, how, when, and where. And what I'm arguing for in critical thinking therapy is that, again, we need the entire toolbox available to therapists so that there are many more tools, concepts, and principles to choose from than have been used to date. So that is one of the premises behind this approach. Now, let me unpack a few of these ideas a bit more, and then I'm going to come to the concept of critical thinking and unpack that a bit. So remember that I said earlier that therapists may be using a partial, let's say, an approach to therapy which includes some psychoanalysis, and it may include some cognitive behavioral therapies, and etc. And but if a therapist is locked within a way of thinking, they may be missing something that critical thinking therapy will keep them from missing. So let's say that you have a person who comes to a therapist because of anger issues. And let's say the real problem is that the person needs to exercise more and is not happy in his career field that he's chosen. And but he comes and he's got anger issues against his wife. So what does the therapist do, possibly? So the person says, I'm angry at my wife, here's what she does, and this is what I do. But the real problem is something entirely different. And so the therapist may, in a given case, say, okay, let us go back and see what is causing your anger. You're angry at your wife. Let's see, does that come from something that happened in your past, possibly, where you were angry at your mother, and et cetera, whatever they may say. And so what I'm saying in this case is that there may be something that we need to dig up from the past, but there may not be. And so what we need is to think more broadly about the process of therapy and help the individual person or ourselves focus in on the problems that we really do have, that really are causing us to feel mentally and emotionally unwell. And again, we need a broad perspective here. Connected to this is, remember that humans are not monological, we're multilogical. There are many variations of the human animal. We do share certain sets of tendencies. We all reason, and I'll come back to that. That's one example. That's one of the main things that humans do with their minds. We are all sometimes or often egocentric, locked within our own point of view, or sociocentric, locked within the group's point of view, more for the group. The group is great. Everyone outside of the group, we don't care about that mentality, sociocentric thinking. All of us reason, all of us are sometimes sociocentric, sometimes egocentric, sometimes rational. And these are just some examples of ways in which we are similar. But what about all the ways in which we are different? And what about all the ways in which the environment affects people differently, given the way that individual is interacting with the environment? So as soon as we begin to look at it, the human mind this way, we begin to see problems in categorizing human behavior and understanding it. So what we need is a very broad, again, thorough approach to the human mind, which critical thinking gives us. And we need to remember that the human mind itself is highly complex. And in a given situation, we may not know what causes a person exactly to do this or that. What we need to ask is, what are the tools of critical thinking that help us understand the multilogical nature of our own minds? And now, let me say a couple of other things, and then I'm going to move on again to the theory of critical thinking. Now, again, it's true that, as I've mentioned, that we do not have an overall integrated approach to therapy that is shared across therapists. And it's even true that many therapists themselves are not aware of the theories they're using with their clients. And this is not acceptable, because if you are a professional and you are presumably helping someone develop their minds or become more emotionally well, you should be able to articulate to the client specifically the theories that you are using on that client. Just as we are required in critical thinking to articulate the critical thinking theory, we are arguing for everyone to be using in order to improve their reasoning. So there is a lot that the therapist is taking on in terms of responsibility. And sadly, it may be true that every therapist is their own theoretician, in the sense that very few have one or two or three theories that they're using that they could articulate well, that they come back to again and again, that we could study and see that they're using systematically. One psychologist told me this: each therapist has their own cosmology. This is problematic. So if you are a client and you are in therapy, you should be able to ask your therapist precisely the theories that that person is using. And if the person is unclear, then this should give you pause. And remember that if some studies show that going to therapy is as good as having someone that you can just talk to who will just listen to your problems. Well, if that's true, then why don't you just go to someone who will listen to you, and that will help you with your problems? Why would you pay someone to help you who's a professional, and if the outcomes are going to be the same? So the outcomes in therapy need to be higher than they would be if the person otherwise did nothing or just talked to a friend. And now we do know that where cognitive behavioral therapy approaches are working, when they are actually incorporating critical thinking into the theory and practice, we do know that outcomes are better for clients on the whole. So we already have that data. We don't have research on how the use of the full toolbox of critical thinking is helping clients, as against a more partial or watered down approach you might get in a cognitive behavioral therapy session. We don't have the data comparing critical thinking therapy to other forms of therapy because we don't yet have critical thinking therapists per se. And by that, I mean a therapist who has internalized the rich theory of critical thinking that is laid out in this new book, Critical Thinking Therapy, and who is coming to the therapeutic setting with the background knowledge that is here in the book, and again, mainly couched in theory of critical thinking. Remember, too, the conceptual nature of the human mind. Some would have us reduce the human mind to the physiological. They would have us reduce the mind to the brain. And by doing that, they can then make the move that then we can treat the brain, and therefore we've treated the mind. But first of all, there is much that we don't know about the relationship between brain and mind. But one thing that we do know is that the brain is physiological, it's scientific. The mind is not. The mind is conceptual. And so if we need an answer to the problem, how do we help someone with their mental well-being? The first move we have to make is that this is a conceptual problem fundamentally, because the problem that the person experiencing is likely about their reasoning and problems in their reasoning. Now, whether the person can command the reasoning, can find the problems in the reasoning, and correct the reasoning is another matter and another question. In other words, often we can say, well, theoretically, the person could reason well, but an actual point of fact, the person couldn't. So we could see the steps the person would need to take, but the persons themselves can't. So this is a problem because in other words, we need to understand that we have to develop the conceptual side of the mind, and we have to bank on the conceptual side of the mind because that's what the mind is. It's conceptual. And some of you are thinking, what does that even mean? And the reason it's difficult to understand what that means is because we ourselves live in the conceptual dimension as reasoners, and therefore it's hard to understand the conceptual dimension itself. So let me go now to a brief overview of critical thinking, and then I'm going to segue to critical thinking therapy. To understand, let us say, if we are to have a defensible concept of critical thinking, then it's going to have to do certain things. One is it's going to have to explain to us what you mean by critical and what you mean by thinking. So that's an early move. So if you ask someone, what is critical thinking? And they can't answer that, then there's a problem. So critical relates directly to the term criteria. Criteria, now we have criteria for thinking. So critical thinking provides that criteria that we need to be thinking at the highest levels of quality. So criteria, front and center. So somebody says, well, you need criteria for thinking. Then you need to ask, well, what criteria would you be adhering to if you're thinking critically? So we're coming back to that. So then we have thinking. What do we mean by thinking? Well, now again, we're in the conceptual dimension. When we say critical thinking, we tend to mean by thinking reasoning. So we mean critical reasoning. We mean criteria for reasoning. So in other words, we need to figure out what this criteria is and what is involved in our reasoning. And you may say, what about, well, are there any other forms of thinking? And there are, such as imagination, fantasy, associational thinking. This leads to that thinking. This leads to that thinking. Just relaxing your thinking. You're just it's the end of your day and you're just relaxing, and that's fine because your mind is moving from this idea to that idea to this idea to that idea. That's not an example of reasoning. What we must do is command our reasoning, because our reasoning needs to take the front and center of all of our thinking, or be in command of all of our thinking, because let us say I'm just relaxing my mind and I'm doing associational thinking and I'm not trying to figure anything out. And then I see that there's a fire in the down the road a bit and it looks like it could be coming my way. I'm not going to say, well, I'm just going to be continuing my my associational thinking here because that's what I'm doing. No, my reasoning is going to take command and say, you need to make a move here, Linda. So the associational thinking is over. The reasoning is going to tell me, my reasoning will tell me that. So we need to understand then and unpack critical reasoning as a beginning place for a rich conception of critical thinking. So what are these criteria for reasoning? What are the best, what standards have the best thinkers used throughout history? Let me name a few. Clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth, logicalness, significance, fairness, sufficiency, and the list goes on. These standards come to us through history, through the best thinkers who have documented their thinking for us. So we can look at a piece of work and we say that is clear, that the examples used are accurate, the information used is relevant or not, and so forth. You see the simplicity of the standards, what we term intellectual standards, but you could also call them critical thinking standards. So we have criteria for thinking. This must be at the center of any rich conception of critical thinking. Now let's move to, as we're on criteria, let's relate this to critical thinking therapy. So if I am a thinker and I am trying to become more mentally well, but my thinking is unclear, inaccurate, irrelevant, illogical, superficial, imprecise, narrow, unfair, and etc. If my thinking is all of those opposites of the intellectual standards, you can see, I think, how this is going to affect my mental health. So if I'm in a relationship, let's say an intimate relationship, and now we are arguing and my thinking is illogical and I'm systematically illogical, and you, my partner, are trying to convince me that I'm being illogical, but I can dance around you with my egocentric thinking and show you how I actually am logical, you can see that I'm violating the standard of logicalness. So we're entering the mind in a very direct way here. We're saying, are you logical in this situation? And what can you do to change what you yourself are doing? You may say, wait a minute, it's this other person. He's bringing it out in me. It's not my fault. But it is a decision to stay in such a relationship. And therefore, it is your fault. If you are unwell mentally, the first thing you have to say is, I'm the one who has to get me unwell. And if I'm not well, then if you want to put blame somewhere, you're going to have to blame it on myself. It's my fault that I'm not mentally well because I have the tools to become mentally well. And some will say, that's not true because my past comes back to haunt me again and again and again. And these horrible things have happened to me. And I can't do anything about these memories that keep popping into my mind. Then we have to ask, is that true? Is that logical? Is it absolutely the case that that idea has to pop into your head? Or is there something you can do to intervene? Notwithstanding the fact that horrible things happen to people, we have to appreciate that. We have to understand that there are some deep scars that we may carry forward. But that doesn't stop us using critical thinking from intervening where we can. This is a key part of critical thinking therapy. Having the confidence that I myself can command the ideas that come into my mind. No one else commands those. I do that. So this is a different way of thinking and a much more healthy way of thinking than we are traditionally doing in human life. So now let's go back to theory of critical thinking. So we've introduced intellectual standards, and we begin to see the importance of adhering to intellectual standards in achieving and maintaining mental health. Then, what do we mean by reasoning? Well, we can boil reasoning down to 8 elements. What are they? Whenever we reason for a purpose or a set of purposes. So purpose is one element of reasoning. Right now, each of you has at least one purpose. That purpose may have changed as we've moved through this presentation. That purpose may again alter as you consider and reconsider what we've discussed here after this is over. You will then go and do something else. Let's say go and have some food, and when you do, you will have a purpose. And then you will maybe go and do something else. Maybe you decide to do some exercising. You will have a purpose or set of purposes. We can't reason without purposes, and what humans mainly do throughout the day is reason through problems and issues. At the heart of critical thinking therapy is the understanding that it is our reasoning that is leading us to a high or low level of mental well-being. It is our reasoning that we must enter. It is our reasoning that we must understand. It is our reasoning that we must command. And it is other people's reasoning that we must also be able to understand and not distort. So whenever we reason to some purpose or set of purposes. We ask questions. Remember, I opened with questions. What questions are you asking in your life? What questions are guiding your intimate relationships? What questions are guiding your parenting? We can figure out the answers to those if we can come in and see what you're doing in your intimate relationship and your parenting. We can tell you what questions you're asking by your actions, but you yourself may not be aware of what those questions are. So critical thinking enables us to uncover those questions and to see them as they actually are. So a parent, for example, may think that the question may be, how can I help this child develop? That may be the question the parent thinks she's asking. But the real question may be, how can I get power over this child? That would be an egocentric question. So we sometimes are asking rational questions and sometimes irrational. So whenever we reason to some purpose or purposes. We ask questions. We use or gather information. We make inferences based on that information and the assumptions that we're making, that we're taking for granted, that are connected to our concepts, all of which is couched within and influenced by our point of view. All 7 of which elements lead to implications and consequences in some cases if we act upon our reasoning. So the elements of reasoning: purpose, question, information, inferences, assumptions, concepts, point of view, and implications. In critical thinking, we study these in order to understand how our reasoning is going wrong and what we can do to improve our reasoning. Ultimately, what we are looking for in critical thinking is to achieve intellectual character, which means the development of intellectual virtues, in order to become more self-actualized or self-actualizing. And here are some of the intellectual virtues. Intellectual humility, being able to distinguish what I know from what I do not know clearly. Intellectual autonomy, being able to think for myself without needing other people to validate my beliefs, as long as I'm thinking critically. Intellectual integrity, intellectual integrity, expecting of myself the same that I would expect of others. In other words, I'm expecting this of you. I'm expecting you to be honest, therefore I will be honest. I'm expecting you to be fair, and therefore I will be fair. It also means that I say what I mean and I mean what I say. So persons of integrity are also persons who are authentic. They're not fake. They're not going along with everyone else. Intellectual courage, the courage to look within my beliefs, within my mind to my beliefs, and to examine those beliefs honestly and in a forthright way. Which beliefs are you fearful of that are occurring in your mind? Why do you fear examining a belief? Because this kind of fear is at the heart of mental health problems in some cases. Any hidden fears, any hidden anxieties, these are at the heart of mental health problems. So you can't just hide those and say, well, this is just one area of my life. I'm just not going to focus on that one, but on these others, I'll really do a good job. It doesn't work that way. You have to think well within all the essential domains of your life. And critical thinking, again, helps us do this. Other intellectual virtues include intellectual perseverance, the ability and the willingness to actually develop your mind, practice. We have study groups for this purpose at the Foundation for Critical Thinking. We have one that's been going 5 years now, and we have 2 other groups. We hope that you'll join us for future study groups. But this is one way for us to study together. But no matter what the case, we're going to have to persevere ourselves individually, and we're going to have to keep working through the discomfort of facing problems in our thinking that we've always held dear. You're not going to just say, oh yeah, this idea that I've had for 35 years, well, that's a bad idea, so let's just throw that out. That's ideal thinking. So if you can do that, then you're approaching the ideal level. But mostly people want to hold on to their beliefs through, again, egocentric and sociocentric thinking. Another intellectual virtue, confidence in reason. Confidence that in the end, the best reasoning is what we want to rely upon, what we must rely upon. It has this process of believing in the facts is the most likely to lead us to the rational, fair-minded, critical thinking societies. And sometimes we don't like what the facts are showing us, but me liking it or not liking is not relevant to whether I'm going to believe it. If I'm embodying confidence in reason, and realize, of course, that none of us will embody intellectual virtues perfectly, because if we did, we would then be the perfect person. And since there is no such person, then we can only do our best to embody them. Intellectual empathy is another intellectual virtue. The tendency to think within other viewpoints And to do this in good faith, in order to understand those viewpoints, to open up those viewpoints, and to be able to appreciate those viewpoints, not to dismiss them, to be moved by them as we are moved by the facts. And essentially, another intellectual virtue is fair-mindedness. And this is at the heart of our approach to critical thinking. Why? Because the fact is there is an ethical dimension to human life. People will try to skirt around this. Theoreticians will try to pretend as if we can just ignore ethics, and we don't really need that in a rich conception of critical thinking or therapy, and neither of these is true. There is an ethical dimension to human life. As soon as there are two people together in a room, or there's a human and any other sentient creatures, there's an ethical dimension present. We have to consider the rights and needs of other sentient creatures, including humans, according to the circumstances, and we must consider our needs in a way equal to the way we consider the needs of others. So again, here I'm beginning to unpack theory of critical thinking, which will be further, of course, unpacked in this critical thinking therapy approach and in the book. Now, I've already mentioned the problems of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. So let me bring together the theory that I've been just briefly discussing and bring in the problem of irrationality here. So we need to be focusing on the development of intellectual virtues to develop emotionally and intellectually. I've talked about the importance of adherence to intellectual standards and the importance of understanding the elements of our reasoning, our purposes, our questions, and so forth. And you can see there is a lot more there that we're going to have to get into. Again, this is just a beginning place. But if that were all we had to do, that would be easy, because we could just teach those and we could be using those. And I could say, are you being logical right now? And we were having an argument, and you would say, yes, I'm being illogical. And I'd say, well, here's what you need to do. And you'd say, fine. And then we'd go on. But that's not what typically happens. What happens is one person or both, let's say again, in any relationship, as an example, may be thinking illogically, but thinking they're perfectly rational. And then we come in and say, well, what about this theory of critical thinking? What about being logical? You're being illogical here. And the person says, well, I am being logical. The other person says, I am being logical. We're saying, no, you're being illogical. And this will fall flat, because how are we going to convince the person that they're being illogical? Well, one important way is in helping people understand their own irrational tendencies that, in this case, keep them from being logical. So the person may be locked within some selfish viewpoint, or simply some old way of thinking that's always worked for me. So those are the two primary forms of egocentric thinking: selfishness or closed-mindedness, locked within my own logic that looks to me to be perfectly logical, but has problems within it in terms of logic. But in the mind, it appears perfectly fine, reasonable, realistic, and so forth. So those are two forms of egocentric thinking that exist in all of us to some degree. And then sociocentric thinking is the other form of irrationality, these being, of course, being very large, complex sets of concepts, but this is a beginning place. So if egocentric thinking is largely focused on what I can get for myself, then sociocentric thinking is largely focused on what the group can get for itself. So that would be what I call groupishness, selfishness versus groupishness. And then if egocentric thinking is locked within an individual person's logic, sociocentric thinking may be one form of it is being locked within the logic of the group. So these are beginning places for thinking about the barriers within you, within me, to mental health. And this theory, I will argue, taking all of these concepts together, the criteria for reasoning, the elements of reasoning, the virtues that we're reaching for, and all of the tools that all of those concepts provide, as well as deeply understanding our egocentric and sociocentric nature, I'm arguing that these should be at the center of all therapies, or let's say most therapies, with few exceptions, because wherever you have human thinking, wherever you have humans with emotional problems, you have them thinking. And when you have them thinking, you have them reasoning, and that's where we need to enter where possible to help them improve their lives. And now you may ask, well, what about, where does medication come into play here, Linda? You keep saying the mind is conceptual, but what about those exceptions? And what about what about the, let's say, what medications can do, what pharmacology can do for people? And the answer is you have to look at the individual case. What I will argue is that, sadly, for many of the psychosomatic drugs that we advance within mainly psychiatry, we don't have the longitudinal studies needed to suggest that this is a good path for people to be, in essence, trying to treat the mind by treating the brain. And I'm not saying there aren't certain cases where this may be helpful. I am saying that no matter what you do, you cannot escape your reasoning. And we need to begin with reasoning, and so that each of us understands the role that reasoning is playing in our own life. And then we can then decide, using our reasoning, whether to take this or that given form of medication. But if we do decide to take medication, then for a psychological problem, we need to make sure we know what the long-term implications of taking those medications are. And if we're taking more than one medication, which is often the case, we need to know what the drug interactions of those medications are. And if you're taking 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 or 14 types of medications, I don't know that we could possibly tell you what the drug interactions are. By logic, it seems that would be something that would be an entire overload to the human body. I again say, I'm not commenting on individual cases. I'm simply coming back to this. You can never escape your reasoning. Whatever drugs you take or don't take or decide to take, or someone else convinces you to take, you will need to make these decisions using your reasoning. So you can never escape the conceptual dimension of human life, because you're thinking through the conceptual dimension constantly. Now, or routinely, not every moment, but routinely throughout your day. Let me give you a few other thoughts before I begin to bring this to a close. In the Critical Thinking Therapy book, of course, as I say, I detail these concepts that I've been talking about here. I'm giving a number of activities that people can begin to work through right away, and I'm just going to mention a few of these to you. There are 22 activities to get you started in the early part of the book, and of both books. And here's one, for example, activity 11, pursue happiness in productive, realistic ways, the only ways that work. And here's this, I'm just going to come down to the actual activity. There's an introduction to the activity, but here's what the activity asks you to do to help unpack your thinking here. On the following occasion, I pursued something that I incorrectly thought would bring me happiness. My positive feelings lasted for approximately how much time? I now realize I was after a goal that was not in my best interest because, notice we're focusing on purpose here, your goal. Instead of chasing this goal, I would have been better off doing the following. In the future, instead of going after superficial ideals, I will blank. So in other words, here's what I did. Here's what I'm thinking about it now as I'm analyzing it and assessing it. And here's what I intend to do in the future. And many of the activities have a similar type format. Here's one. Entertain new ideas. Open your mind to better ways of viewing situations. Again, I'm skipping down to the activity. Complete the following statements, focusing on a situation in which you are unable to consider a reasonable alternative way of looking at a situation. 1, the situation was as follows. 2, I was narrow-minded in the situation, so I reacted as follows. It felt as follows in the situation. In other words, this is how I felt because this is how I was thinking. I could have reacted more reasonably as follows, or if I had done the following. If I had reacted more reasonably, my thinking would have been more open-minded in the following ways. Based on this analysis, in a similar situation in the future, instead of being narrow-minded, I will do what? So we're digging into your thinking in a way that utilizes critical thinking therapy. I'm not detailing all of that theory here, but the critical thinking theory is underlying all of these activities that enable us to unpack our thinking. Here's another one. Stop allowing others to harm you through your unreasonable thoughts. The situation I'm in is that the situation I'm in that is or may be harmful to me is. Write it out. I believe the harm being done to me is what? The problems in the thinking of the person harming me are. The problem in my thinking in this situation, the problems in my thinking in the situation are, and I need to replace these thoughts with the following more reasonable thoughts. Based on this analysis, I intend to do what? So again, this just gives you a starting place for thinking about how you can work through these activities, and it is in working through these activities that you find the problems in your thinking, not in reading theory of critical thinking. So if you're going to only do one thing with either of these books, just do the activities. Don't even read the theory, just do the activities. Most people want to do it the other way around. They read the theory, it sounds really good, I like it, let's go on to, yeah, I read that book. Let's go to something else. This is not the way to develop as a self-actualizing person, which requires these tools of criticality that I've been focusing on. In the latter part of the book, I just wanted to point out that there is a section on the fact that now that you've thought about this theory of critical thinking and how it can help you in terms of your emotional life and your ability to become more self-actualizing, this chapter focuses on the domains, the primary domains in human life within which all of us need to reason well in order to function at the highest level that humans are capable of functioning at. In other words, there are certain dimensions to everyone's life that we don't share all of them, but we share many of these dimensions, and we need to reason well within all of them to be mentally well. So we have, for example, a section on professional life, intimate relationships, sexuality, parenting, friendships, physical health, self-development, enrichment, and relaxation, the psychological dimension, your social life, your history, ecology and your relationship with nature, how you think about science and the natural world, your finances, civic and ethical responsibility, religion, metaphysics, mortality, your technological orientation, and how you think about power. There are more, of course, but this gives you a starting place for thinking about each of these dimensions of your life in a more deep way than maybe you have in the past. And I'm just going to read a few questions from the section moving forward on your history. I mentioned that as one of the dimensions of your life. Here are some questions you can ask yourself to understand how you think about the history of your life. Are you trapped in the story you tell yourself about your past? Or are you emancipated by it? In other words, do you define how you see your past? Are you actively shaping what you do today rather than obsessing over memories? Does your interpretation of your past hold you back from future possibilities? How can you take command of the story you tell yourself about the past to let go of resentments towards those you perceive to have harmed you? What do you gain by holding on to these resentments? Now, there are several other questions there. I'm not going to read further there because we need to bring this to a close, and I will stay for a few questions. But let me mention that in Critical Thinking Therapy, the larger book, there is a section toward the back, actually there's an appendix entitled Improve Your Mental Health by Reading Classic Literature. What I understand is that there are many ways to become mentally well. And one of them is reading deep ideas. And we do this by reading classic literature of the highest quality, what I would call the essential classics. This is one of many ways that we may use to develop our mental and emotional well-being. And I'm going to mention others. Again, I have a section in the book on now I've already mentioned that critical thinking theory brings many, many tools to the therapeutic setting. But what critical thinking also does is provides the vehicle for critiquing all other therapies, because all other therapies are based in reasoning, and it is critical reasoning that we need to determine what is best in these theories, what is not let's say, what is not sound in these theories, where these theories may help a given therapist in a given situation, and so on. So we need critical thinking for both of these purposes. So in chapter 10 of the larger critical thinking therapy book, I talk about very briefly other mental health therapy approaches, so that if you are in therapy, you can have a better sense of the primary theories being used today in therapeutic settings. And I also have a section on alternative and organic mental health therapies, where I'm detailing, or not detailing, but introducing many forms of therapy that we're all aware of, that we should be considering for our own mental health as they may help us as individuals. So let me read some of these. Therapy through nature, therapy through animals, therapy through art and creative processes, therapy through giving, music therapy, therapy through sports, through exercise, through meditation and relaxation, through reading, through writing, through work, through dance. Notice I say through work. Some people find that that's what they need for their mental well-being, to work. But I'm also mentioning that some people are spending too much time at work, and therefore it's not a therapeutic process, but one that is turning back on itself. So even if you enjoy working and this is one of your favorite things to do, it doesn't follow that you shouldn't be doing other things, because we do need to be well balanced. And again, each of us has to decide what that means for us. Here's another form: therapy through dance. Therapy through intellectual development. I mentioned that in terms of reading the classes, joining study groups, working together with people who want to develop their minds. Therapy, again, through discussion groups. Therapy through travel. Some people enjoy that. Some people need that. Therapy through communal living. Some people can enjoy that and that will work for them. But remember that in every communal setting, you're going to have egocentric and sociocentric thinking to some degree. Then there are sexual therapies, play therapies. And then I end with therapy through almost anything that makes you happy, as long as you're not harming anyone else. So we want to think of therapy for our mental and emotional well-being in this broader sense, and so that we can find what works for us individually. Now let me end by going back to my Appendix B, in which I'm beginning to discuss classic literature that is relevant to mental health. And I start with, and it's a very brief section, but I start with Socratic thinking and some quotes from Plato on Socratic thinking. And then I move on to Stoic philosophy. There is a lot of overlap between Stoic philosophy and critical thinking. And I want to end by reading a couple of quotes from Seneca. So Seneca is writing around the era he lived from around the year 4 before Common Era to the year 65 Common Era. He says, no one can lead a happy life, or even one that is bearable, without the pursuit of wisdom. The perfection of wisdom is what makes the happy life. Although even the beginnings of wisdom make life bearable. Yet this conviction, clear as it is, needs to be strengthened and given deeper roots through daily reflections. Making noble resolutions is not as important as keeping the resolutions you have made already. You have to persevere and fortify your pertinacity until the will to good becomes a disposition to good. Remember, I was talking about the virtues. These are dispositions. Fair-mindedness, confidence in reason. What Seneca is saying here directly overlaps with critical thinking theory for the development of happiness. And then Seneca encourages people to think philosophically, and by this he means living the examined life and developing one's character in the way Socrates advised. Seneca says, you've no grounds for forming a ready, hasty belief in yourself. Carry out a searching analysis and close scrutiny of yourself in all sorts of different lights. Consider above all else whether you've advanced in philosophy or just in actual years. Philosophy is not an occupation of a popular nature. It molds and builds the personality, orders one's life, regulates one's conduct, shows one what one should do and what one should leave alone or leave undone, sits at the helm and keeps one on the correct course as one is tossed about in perilous seas. Without it, no one can lead a life free of fear or worry. A good character is the only guarantee of everlasting carefree happiness. So these are words from Seneca that I will leave you with, they get at the heart of what critical thinking therapy is all about. The disciplined command of the mind leading to the development of one's own individual capacities, while the person is also contributing to the greater good. But if you are not centered in yourself, if you are not taking care of yourself, if you're allowing your egocentric thinking to run you and your sociocentric thinking to run you, if you are not working on your mind and asking your mind to become more and more disciplined in the ways that Seneca is suggesting, then you're not using the tools of critical thinking available to you. So I want to end by saying thank you all for joining me. I know this has been a longer overview than we intended, but I wanted to give you a sense of the whole picture. And now I will take some questions as you may have them. I'm getting a question here. So Marilyn, there's a certain amount of distrust of people who engage in critical thinking. Well, first of all, societies, the way that we have designed them, are set up so that people are supposed to follow the rules within those societies. And though we tell people that we want them to think critically, and though we tell our students we want them to question, do we really mean it? And what happens when somebody actually does ask questions? And then that's a short step from there to, is it now dangerous living in the United States even to ask a question of a certain type? Do we even have the freedom to ask these questions? So yes, critical thinking is always distrusted by the powers that be, because remember, the way that people who are unethical stay in power is by keeping people thinking uncritically, keeping them indoctrinated, keeping them following in line. And this is and always has been a serious problem in human societies. Repetition plays a role in critical thinking in the same way that repetition plays a role in learning to play tennis or learning to play the piano or doing anything else that involves multiple skill sets that have to come together. And it's not what we need is, I'm not sure repetition is the term so much as daily practice, which is why one of the reasons why I've included so many activities in this book, and we have lots of activities in our academy, in our community online, because again, it's this kind of practice that we've got to engage in if we're going to develop as thinkers. We can't just let our thinking do what it's doing. All of you who are here are good at thinking, or you wouldn't be here. You are good to a significant degree as thinkers. That's not the question. The question is, how can you improve your thinking? And this is a much more difficult question, because whatever let's say any given person may be thinking at a B level. You may be a B level thinker, B minus in most parts of your life. But let's say in parenting, you're a C minus or a D plus. Well, then that's going to be a problem. So we have to think about practicing across the domains of our lives. And overcoming trauma is right in there with this. Anytime you have memories coming into your mind, this is where the trauma keeps coming from. You've got to figure out how to intervene in that. You have to figure out how to stop those thoughts coming into your mind. And if somebody says, well, it's impossible, they're always going to come in, then by logic, then there's nothing we can do. So then you're always just going to be constantly traumatized because there's nothing you can do about it. And that is not at the heart of theory of critical thinking. At the heart of critical thinking is that we can command our minds, that we can control the thoughts that come into the mind. And if some thoughts are coming into my mind that I'm not feeling that I'm controlling, then I've got to stop everything else and I've got to figure out how to control those. But often people, when they start learning theory of critical thinking, they'll think they're thinking critically when they're not. They'll think that, okay, now I've got this theory of critical thinking. So there's this traumatic memory coming into my mind. So now I'm going to think about my thinking about that, I'm thinking about it, how I'm thinking about it. What you've got to do is stop the thinking coming in. That's the goal. The traumatic thinking memory that you keep bringing into your mind. That's the target place. And the answer to that may be going over to the piano and taking out the book and start playing. That may be the answer right then. The answer may be get in the car and go somewhere. Because right now I'm being traumatized. And thinking about it and telling myself to stop thinking about it and thinking I'm thinking critically and wondering why that's not working is not thinking critically. If it's not working, then it's not the critical thing. Either you're misunderstanding critical thinking itself, or you think you're applying it when you're not. So it's very hard to advocate critical thinking in schools. Marilyn, yes, we commiserate, and I'm not sure what to say other than we are at a sad place in history in terms of schooling at all levels in human societies on the whole. And now, speaking just of the United States, it's pretty clear that our schools have declined in terms of critical thinking rather than improved on the whole in the past few decades. So reform of the schools never happened. The reform that was promised in the 1960s and 1970s, that dream of critical thinking across the disciplines that was beginning to merge in the 1980s was more or less beginning to die down in the 1990s. And what we have now is everyone and their friend and their family member and everyone else thinking they are experts in critical thinking. We have philosophy departments who have continued to control the definitions and the concept of critical thinking using old, antiquated tools, primarily such as argumentation theory and fallacy theory. This has enabled lots of charlatans and well-meaning people to come forth with their so-called concept of critical thinking. And now we're at a place where people think there is no shared conception of critical thinking. And this simply is not true. There is a shared core conception of critical thinking. That core is shared by primary scholars in the field of critical thinking. And those scholars emerged mainly in the 1980s, moving in the 1990s. We continue to develop the theory of critical thinking, but we don't have a situation in which critical thinking has its own place, individual and separate place in academia. So philosophers grabbed it early on. They still partially have it, but then they failed because they were using antiquated approaches And other fields came along and said, well, they're not doing that. They're not teaching what they say they're teaching through critical thinking over here. So we'll just say we do it over here in our field. So it's psychology and critical thinking. It's literature and critical thinking, sociology and critical thinking. Now ask the person teaching that what their theory of critical thinking is. And what you'll often find is it's what they did before as a sociologist, for example, and now they're calling it critical thinking. So there's a lot of confusion in academia. There are a lot of political forces against critical thinking in the United States today. There are a lot of political forces affecting our schools at all levels in terms of critical thinking today. And let me say this from a personal example. A few years ago, at a keynote address at our conference, I was talking about in my opening remarks the importance of encouraging freedom of speech in the classrooms. That was the primary point. Freedom of speech, the relationship between freedom of speech and freedom of thought. I was developing that idea. And afterwards, in the halls, I could hear teachers openly arguing against this theory that I had laid down. They were saying, no, students shouldn't have this right. They shouldn't have that we shouldn't be encouraging them to think freely. Who does she think she is encouraging that? But they themselves were exercising their right to speak freely about what they didn't like about what I said. But they don't want the same for their students. So the fact is there are a lot of problems in human thinking. There are a lot of problems in academia. There are a lot of problems in the way we run businesses and the way we run government organizations and the military. Problems everywhere, incompetency everywhere, and that's the status quo. So where you meet someone that's highly competent, you should feel happy and you should celebrate and you should enjoy that moment. And you should remember Marilyn is saying, what can we do about this? And others of you are asking, what can we do? This is what you can do, and this is all you can do. Stay within your focus of influence. Never get out of that circle. Consider it a thick black line around you that you are not going to step over. Because if you step over that line, you are now outside of your circle of power. And what are you doing out there? Making yourself miserable, becoming irritated because other people won't do what you see is so obvious. But remember, sometimes what I see that's so obvious is actually my ego. So even those of us who study critical thinking theory for years and years and years, we still think egocentrically and sociocentrically. We still think we're right when we're wrong, because egocentric and sociocentric thinking always look rational to the mind. So if my rational thinking looks rational and my irrational thinking looks rational, well, then what hope is there for any of us? But if we are adhering to the tools and principles of critical thinking, and we realize, therefore, we will often err, that is our best hope. And then we help others as we can, and we worry not about anything else, because that's just self-abuse. And you cannot be mentally well if you're abusing yourself and telling yourself, why can't I get these people to do this? Why can't I get them to do that? What's wrong with these people? So you've got to leave that behind. Advocate where you can, use your power when you can, use it as much as you can, but use it while keeping yourself mentally well. Someone asked, how can we help neurodivergent individuals in their critical thinking in ways that are not offensive? Well, I would hope that we don't use critical thinking in ways that are offensive to anyone. And I think that all of us are neurodivergent to some degree. We're all individuals. We're all unique. Each one of us is. And I think the best way to teach anyone who can reason critical thinking is to introduce them to the tools as gradually and as well as we can. We can begin this with very young children. We can do this to some degree with people who have limitations. But the ways in which we teach critical thinking will be very similar no matter the circumstance. We still have to get you to read and get you to write and ask you to discuss among yourselves and help you learn to clarify what you're saying by looking at other people's work and seeing their sentences that are unclear, and working together to help one another with our thinking where we can. So there are a lot of things that we can do, general things that will help any person. And I think of all individuals as having access, who can reason, having some access to critical thinking. It says, young people are interested in learning what you are talking about, but others slam them down for it. It's a bit of an illusion, I think, to say that young people are interested in learning this. It's because what happens is, this happens generation after generation after generation. We look at the younger generation and we say, well, they're more flexible minded and they're more open. So maybe they'll be the ones that figure this out, and maybe they'll be the ones that save everything. And look what happened in the 1960s and 70s. The young people said, we're not going to have this Vietnam War. We're not going to have this lack of freedom of speech. We're going to have our rights. We're going to have all this better society. We're going to have all this open-mindedness. But critical thinking was never at the heart of that revolutionary process to any significant degree beyond the obvious, because once the few things were achieved that then in themselves were important, we weren't able to sustain movement toward higher ground beyond minimal achievement of, let's say, the rights that were being shouted for. This young group that was coming forward, these young people who had all these ideas, what did they end up doing in the long run? Going into business, going into government, status quo. So not all of them, but many, if not most of them, joined the ranks of the indoctrinated. And part of the reason is because our society and societies more generally are based in the concept of that we have developed of capitalism. Capitalism itself is such a driving force. We could say now unbridled capitalism. And this is what ends up determining largely what these young people will end up doing and so forth. So we can't say that young people are open to critical thinking. We can say that when people are younger, they have a better chance of learning critical thinking if they are encouraged to and it becomes part of the fabric of society. We are nowhere near that reality now. We're very far from that reality now. And though if we could reach these young people, we could make a difference. I'm convinced of that. We don't have the vehicles to reach them now because of these other variables. We need the vehicles. We need to press for them, but they're largely not there now. So these young people, some of them or many of them may have this flexibility of mind that we all have when we're younger, to some degree. It doesn't follow that they're going to make any significant difference in the future any more than any generations have done in the past, with the exception that because of the way in which how fast we're destroying planet Earth, this is going to drive much of what humans have to deal with moving forward, whether we want to face it or not. We're going to be running, we're going to be moving, running from tornadoes, running from heat, running from drought, running from floods, running, moving to higher ground, physically, or places that are more safe or less hot or less humid or whatever the case may be. And so we're going to have to think critically to even survive. And you could say we've thought critically just enough as humans to be surviving, but we're not surviving very well. And look what we're doing to other sentient creatures. So just a few more questions. Jamel asks, how does self-government relate to critical thinking therapy? Well, first of all, there are different forms of self-government, but let's just say democracy generally. What I would argue is making a more broad point is that critical thinking, because of the complexities in human life, is required for all of us to be emotionally well. We have to think critically to some degree, if not a large degree, to be emotionally well. And there's one step from that to being able to govern ourselves well. If we cannot have functioning democracies if we do not think critically. We are seeing examples of that throughout the world. So a governmental structure can only do so much for us when it is humans that are mainly flawed who are working within that governmental structure. So self-government requires critical thinking. Effective government in any form requires critical thinking. And mental well-being is one application of critical thinking. And to me, it is a core and central application of critical thinking. In other words, some people come to critical thinking, many people do, from the field of from academic fields, and they don't want to talk about their own mental well-being. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to get ideas to bring into their classrooms for their students to think more critically. Typically, these faculty think they themselves are already thinking critically. They don't need critical thinking. It's their students that need it. So they want to actually skip over learning critical thinking, and they want to give it to their students without learning it themselves. And this is problematic. So most people do not realize the central role that critical thinking should play in their own mental health. And I'm saying that should be a first move that we make, not a second move. It's an early move. And then let me move on quickly. There's too much emphasis on conformity, but what can we do? I agree, it's a sad state of affairs. Poor kids, not encouraged to build the fundamental skills, speaking, listening, reading, writing, what Paul told us in his 90s books. Why do we get pushed back? I don't know how to answer that. I commiserate with you, Marilyn, on all of these points. And you make other points here that are related, and we could ask, why didn't people listen to Socrates 2,000 years ago? Why have we not listened to him since? Why haven't we listened to the Stoic philosophers? Why have we mainly ignored their big ideas? It's because humans, we know of the normal distribution. If humans fall in the normal distribution, let's say as reasoners, then remember that most people are in the center, and the center is the mediocre middle. The center is a C. So people are mainly thinking, let us say, at a C level. Anyone thinking above that is going to be shot down, potentially ostracized, seen as weird, seen as eccentric, etc., by the mainstream majority. And this is why the individual must be protected from the vulgar masses, and why the Epicurean said to protect yourself from the masses is an important part of staying mentally sane. Because most people are not learning what we're talking about. They're not thinking on this level. They're thinking at a much lower level. They're very superficial. I would argue that many of these people would prefer not to be so superficial, but that's the society that they're living in, and that's the only one that they know, and they are not reading the classics because they're not aware of them, and they never read Richard Paul's book in the 1990s, and they're not aware of critical thinking itself. So there are a lot of problems. Let me bring this to a close. Somebody's asking, where is the book? It will be on Amazon soon, but we prefer that you purchase it from us. You can find it, links to it, from criticalthinking.org. But you can also find these at fctpress.org directly. We've just opened our press again. We did our own publications in the past, and now we're going to be publishing again. We have several publications there now. These two are primary ones coming out now, and you can purchase the books there, fctpress.org. But you can also email us or come to criticalthinking.org, and you will find the links there. And again, I want to thank all of you for your time, for joining me today, for seeing the importance of critical thinking and of critical thinking therapy. If you are a therapist, I hope that you will be using these tools and that you will share with me what you're doing. You may email me at elder@criticalthinking.org. And if you are an individual working with the theory, I would love to hear from you as well. We're just launching this, just making this available to the therapeutic world. So again, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you soon.